Hey, it is a long overdue episode of Tiki Technical Tuesday in which we will continue the adventure of the rhinoceros hornbill. Now, if you recall episode 1, we sculpted it. In episode 2, we made the plaster master mold. And in episode 3, we made these silicone master molds. Now, this episode, episode 4, we are going to use these silicone master molds to make our production plaster molds. And we're gonna need a lot of them. We're gonna need like 10 of these things, and spoilers, I've already gone ahead and made 2, and that is where we're gonna pick up the action right now. While I made these 2 molds, I took careful notes on the amounts of plaster used. Sometimes you mix up too much, sometimes you mix up too little, and I wanted to find the exact amount needed to cast these molds. Once I got that magical amount, I went ahead and wrote it down on all of the mold boxes. I do this for 2 reasons. One, I'm going to be having to make even more molds in the future in this production run. I'll get to that part later. And also just so that I don't forget while I'm working on them. Now, since we have the actual numbers of plaster used, it's time to do some plaster math. So, for this 4-piece mold, I have learned that side A uses 9 pounds of plaster, side B also uses 9 pounds of plaster, and the base piece and the plug piece combined use 4.5 pounds of plaster. That is a total of 22.5 pounds of plaster needed to cast each complete mold. All right, so I've got 2 molds. I need 8 more. Now, plaster is sold in 50-pound bags, so if each mold uses 22.5 pounds of plaster, I'm going to need not 1, not 2, not 3, but 4 50-pound bags of pottery plaster. Before we start mixing, I start to transfer the plaster into these 2 5-gallon plastic buckets. I like to keep the plaster in here because it's easy to get to, and I put these watertight, airtight lids on top of these buckets, which keeps the plaster nice and dry. Plaster likes to suck up water, so when I'm not using the plaster, I keep it in its original bags, but even then it's not quite that safe, so I only keep as much plaster in the studio as I'm going to use so that it doesn't slowly suck moisture out of the air while it's sitting in storage. I also like to make sure that I'm getting fresh plaster from my ceramic supply store. Also, before we start, I have to recommend the Essential Guide to Mold Making and Slipcasting by Andrew Martin. This is my source for plaster ratios, and I will put a link to it in the description of the video. So here is everything we need to get started. An empty bag for old plaster, a water bucket, a mixing bucket on top of a very accurate digital scale, plaster easily accessible inside of buckets. I've got my mixer with a squirrel mixer blade. I'll put a link to that in the description. Water for cleaning, a little bucket for cleaning, and of course the molds. We're going to need our molds for casting. I've got a vibrating table. I'll put a link to that also too, and we'll talk about it some more in a little bit. I have got Windex water and alcohol and more molds. Yeah. I think we can do this now. Okie dokie, so we are going to mix up the first batch of plaster. We're going to do the base. Oh, you can see I just checked to make sure I'm getting the right amount of water and plaster. We're doing the base piece and the little plug piece. Those are the 2 small molds closest to the camera right now. I am using ice cold fresh water. Plaster is dependent on temperature. The warmer the water, the faster your plaster sets. Once again, I'm double checking my plaster amounts by looking at the handy dandy notations on the thing. I zero out the scale and I sift in the plaster. You don't want to dump it in one big clump. You want to gently sift this plaster into the mold. Trust me, you'll get the plaster hydrated better that way, and the more you agitate the plaster putting it in, the faster it will set. We want to have as much working time as we possibly can. Okay, so we're going to let that slake in there. And slaking is when you're letting the plaster just absorb as much water as possible before you begin mixing. It's a common mistake to just put the plaster in and start mixing immediately. You won't get a good, just a really good set thing of plaster at the end. I don't know how to say this. It's just, your plaster's not gonna be as creamy and nice when you mix it up. You just wanna really let it hydrate. And don't worry, it will not set up while it is slaking. I have heard people say that you can, if you gently sift the plaster into the bucket, you can let it slake for almost, I don't know, like a long time. You don't have to worry about it. I'm only gonna slake this for about 2 minutes, and then I'm gonna start mixing it for 1 minute. Now these mixing numbers are my own numbers based on my ratios and my studio environment. You'll have to experiment on your own if you're doing this. Do some practice batches, see what works. Oh, time to go. Okay, so we are going to be using the little hand drill with the squirrel mixer to stir up the plaster. I want to make sure the drill is very clean, so I just rinse it off with some fresh water. If you have any old plaster on the bit, it will actually accelerate the plaster settings. So you want a clean drill, a clean mixer, and we just get in there. And I don't go bonkers, I just use a steady, even mixing speed to get the plaster fully hydrated. Okie dokie, give it a little bump to get the bubbles out. I'm going to give it a quick spritz of alcohol for surface bubbles. And then I'm going to put my little Windex mixture into my molds. And we go for it. Now this one's a little weird. I like to hold it at an angle. I find I capture less bubbles this way, which makes it really weird to pour. So just bear with me. Slow and steady. Once the plaster has poured into all of the delicate lettering on the base of the mug, I don't worry about bubbles as much, so I can level the mold out, make sure it's all seated properly, and fill the rest. You may see some bubbles on the surface of the plaster. Don't panic, we'll take care of them. And the base plug. You start your pour in the lowest part of the mold and let the plaster rise up from there. Slowly, you want to let that surface tension just work its way through, forcing any bubbles out. Plaster is heavy, it's heavier than the air, so it's going to want to force those bubbles out. I've stopped filling it just before the top because we're going to do this. This is why you don't need to buy a fancy vibrating table. You can make your own. But the vibrating table is nice. The last step is topping off the molds, filling them to the very edge with the last bit of plaster and getting rid of those surface bubbles with some alcohol. There we go. This extra plaster will go back into the bag that we left open from filling the buckets. A handy dandy tip is to use the empty bag of plaster to store already mixed up plaster. It's a waterproof bag and you can put it all, whoa, careful, don't spill it. Whoa, 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 whoa. That was close. You can put all of that plaster into here, and it's a great way to just store that set plaster. Once you've got it out of the bucket, be sure to clean it really well. I use this separate bucket of water to avoid getting a lot of plaster into my drain. More on that later. And then as a last step, you want to take it to the sink and really give it a thorough rinse out. You want to make sure that this thing is absolutely clean, because if you have any residual plaster in the bucket, it will accelerate the next batch of plaster in this bucket. So always have a clean bucket. Okay, so we're about to do the larger batch for the big half of the mold here. And I'm going to be using 3 quarts of water, 9 pounds of plaster, and it's going to slake for 2 minutes. I'm giving this one a 2-minute slake because it's a lot of plaster, a lot of water. Yeah, so I got to get back to it. For this larger batch, we're using a larger container. I'm using kind of a big, I think this is a 2-gallon clear bucket I got from a restaurant supply store. I love using these for mixing plaster. They are fantastic. And yes, I am timing this on my watch while I mix. I mix for a specific amount of time. If you mix it for too long, it will set faster. Once the mixing is complete, I knock out any of the large air bubbles and I get rid of surface bubbles with a quick spritz of alcohol. Next up, it's time to prepare the mold with my Windex water mix. This kind of breaks the surface tension on the silicone, and then, hear that? That is the vibrating table in action. This table goes through a variety of vibration cycles, which kind of, makes any bubbles find their way to the surface of the plaster, and it really helps this plaster flow over the surface of the silicone without capturing any bubbles. It's fantastic. As you can see, I am pouring in a very slow and steady fashion. I start filling the model at the lowest point first, and let's let the plaster rise up slowly over the sculpture, or the mold of the sculpture, I should say. You just don't want to rush this. Once it is complete, I'll just tell you right now what I'm doing. Okay, so I'm actually going to move this over here to make room for the next mold before this plaster sets. That's why I didn't fill it up all the way. Gives me a little bit of wiggle room to kind of just carefully get my fingers under here and hopefully not have the word that you know and love, a hashtag plaster disaster. Because this is heavy. Moving molds like this is always an adventure, and the most critical part is once I get it onto the new table, I want to make sure that the jacket, the wooden frame that's around the piece, is settled properly, and that I knock all of the air bubbles out before I fill the mold to the very rim. And of course, the very last step is grabbing that little alcohol spray bottle and getting rid of any surface bubbles. There we go. Okay, so these larger mold sections use a lot more plaster, and I've got the volume dialed in perfectly, so there's almost zero waste. Haha! Now, if you're watching this and wondering why for the smaller mold sections I had so much extra plaster, couldn't I just mix up a smaller batch? I could, but plaster gets weird when you mix it in smaller volumes. It just sets differently. I like the consistency and the timing of a larger batch of plaster. So the batch that I mixed up to do the small plugs is the smallest that I'm comfortable making. Yes, I do end up having to throw away like a third of it. I feel guilty about it, but it leads to a better quality mold in the end. Hey, we're back at the cleaning station, and this is where we're going to get all of that extra plaster residue out of the mixing bucket. You do not want any of this stuff ever to go down your drain, and that is why we're using this handy-dandy separate cleaning bucket. I highly recommend doing this in your studio, and also getting a plaster trap, which we will talk about in a little bit, I promise. Again, I do a final, thorough, clean sponge down of this bucket in the sink. Yes, I have a plaster trap. Yes, we'll talk about that shortly. Don't worry about the plaster. But we want to get the plaster out of this bucket. A common mistake people make is letting plaster residue build up in their mixing buckets, and that will completely accelerate the plaster when you mix your next batch. So get that bucket completely clean. Now that my bucket was clean, I could mix up the final batch of plaster for the final big piece. And here you can see it in action, the vibrating table and the sprayed Windex working in tandem to avoid any air bubbles as the plaster slowly spreads its way across the surface of the mold. Now, the nice thing about this being the very last piece I'm pouring is I don't have to move it off of the plaster casting table. I can just leave it here, which means I can fill it up to the very rim. Okay, so that is one full set of mold pieces poured. We're going to let these things sit for about 45 minutes to an hour so they can go through their chemical reaction and turn hard. Plaster goes through an exothermic reaction, which means it gives off a lot of heat while it's set. So that's a good way for you to check and see if it is fully finished curing. You'll feel once it's going to set up, it's going to turn hard to the touch, but it will not be strong. It's going to go through several stages. It's going to go through like a thickening stage, where it's going to be like a milkshake, and then it's going to turn into like curdled milk. And then it's actually going to seem pretty firm, but it's still going to be cool to the touch. But then it will start to get really hot. And once it has hit peak temperature and starts to cool, you're safe to open these things up, which we will do shortly. Okay, it's been about a half an hour, and I have a fancy space thermometer, and we can check the temperatures of the molds. Okay, so the tabletop is at 75 degrees. The first mold we poured is at 85. In the very last mold that we poured is at 95. It is quite toasty to the touch. I'm gonna give this just a little bit more time before we open it up. Okay, we're gonna go for it. Now, this one is definitely on the cooling end. It's still warm to the touch, but I can tell it's gone over the peak of maximum hot, so I'm just gonna start opening it. I usually like to open these in the order that I want to assemble the mold. This is the bottom piece of the mold, so I'm gonna open this one first and clean it up first. For the smaller molds, like a thin one like this, I sometimes don't even have to take apart the frame. I can just push it right out. We'll have to take apart the frame for the larger ones. Oh, interesting thing about plaster. While it's at its peak high temperature, it actually expands a little bit. So it'll be harder to take them out when they're hot. If I let them wait until they're cool, it will then contract back to the actual size and it'll be easier to take out of the mold. But you can go either way. Just fun fact to know, weird plaster facts. This looks great on this side. This side, not so much. There's a really yucky edge here. So we're going to just clean this up and bevel it, just like we beveled these top edges, just to make sure that this mold handles well and casts nicely.
I do the bulk of the initial shaping work with this tool. It's called a Sureform tool, and it's like a woodworking tool. You'll find it in any kind of Home Depot type store. And I make sure I capture all of the plaster sawdust, if you will, in the plaster waste bucket. From then, once I've got the edges nice and beveled, we move on to the fine sanding step. For sanding, I use this drywall sandpaper. You can find it also in any home improvement store, and it does an incredible job of smoothing out this plaster. I mean, that's what it's really designed for. And I will work on the edges and the whole bottom section to get it just absolutely smooth and wonderful to the touch. Different mold pieces often require different tools. The little plug piece for the mold that you see here has just some really kind of strange tight angles and corners, and it would just be really difficult for me to reach in there with the Sureform tool. So I just use a little, I think it's called a fettling knife. It's just a plaster knife, and that's when I get rid of the bulk of the flashing on. I put the bevel on with this, and then from there I go on to just using sandpaper like we did on the other piece. When I put these molds back together, I triple check those marks and notches that I put on there to make absolutely sure that I orient the silicone correctly in the plywood jackets.
Okay, so we're gonna get into the bigger pieces, and these, sometimes I have to open up the wooden frame on. I only just open one corner, and that usually gets me enough wiggle room to get the silicone out of the wooden jacket. Oh, and they are heavy. Oh, man.
This is where the Craig Jig pocket screws really shine. They are just extremely easy to back out, take the corner apart on the mold, and then put them right back in, and they hold things nice, tight, and square.
Yeah, this is a great time to talk about why we have the lines here and the arrows here, because once this rubber's out, it's hard to remember which way this frame was sitting and which side connected to where. So that's why I like to put more information on this than I think I'll ever need, just to be safe.
We cleaned up the edges of the big pieces just like we did on the smaller pieces, first with the Sureform and then with that fancy drywall sandpaper stuff. And once we get all the edges nice and clean, it's time to assemble the first mold cast.
All right, we have got production mold number, well, I guess this is number 3. My goal is to get 3 of these cast a day. So at the end of today, tomorrow, and the day after, I will have 9 molds combined with the 2 that we've already poured for a total of 10 production molds. Why am I strapping these closed? I'm glad you asked. Plaster can warp while it's drying. This is going to go through a long, even though it feels nice and firm, it's going to take weeks to fully dry out and to fully cure. And during that time, it can warp a little bit if you don't hold it together. So I'm going to keep this completely strapped while it dries in the kiln room.
So there you have it. That is the process that I will be repeating not once, not twice, but oh my God, we're going to need to make 10 of these things. And guess what? Because I like you all so much, I'm not going to make you watch me do it all 10 times.
Okay, so I realize we're going to be doing a lot of the same thing today that we did yesterday, and in fact, we're going to be doing even more of it tomorrow. So today, perhaps I'll just do a vignette, a highlight reel, if you will. If I think of a little tip or technique or something that I didn't talk about yesterday, I'll just shoot it really quick today, and we will stack all of those together. How's that sound? People always ask me, what ratio do I mix up the secret bubble sauce? And I don't really have an exact answer. I will fill up the Windex to, like, I don't know, maybe a quarter. I guess that's maybe like a quarter. So maybe 1/4 Windex to water, and I'll see how that works. Why do we do this? Well, silicone is hydrophobic. It does not like water, so water tends to kind of beat up on its surface, and that can create air bubbles when you're pouring the plaster in. So this breaks the surface tension of the water to silicone kind of process, and it helps to avoid bubbles. It works really well. At least it works for me. A quick note on the water that I'm using. The chemical reaction of plaster can be sped up or slowed down by the temperature of your water. The warmer the water you use, the faster the reaction will happen. So I like to use ice cold tap water, very cold. It gives me just a little bit more working time. So keep water temperature in mind when you're mixing up that plaster. A quick note on these mold straps, also known as universal mold straps, and as you may have guessed, they are used to strap molds closed. Now, you can use large rubber bands like this to hold your molds closed, but when molds get big like this, they hold a lot of slip, and that makes a lot of hydraulic pressure, which can stretch rubber bands to their breaking point, and I want to use the safest things possible with big molds. That's where these come in. They exert a lot of force. In fact, a common mistake with these mold straps is over-tightening them. They're very strong. You don't need to completely clamp them down. And when I do clamp them down, I like to tuck the tails of the mold strap behind the cam because the little leverage cam can sometimes eat away into the surface of the mold. Allow me to demonstrate. Don't have to go too tight. Ta-da! A common mistake I make when I get into the flow of making plaster mold is I forget to press 0 or tear on the scale after I put the water in. This is a disastrous mistake because you start adding plaster, but you have not compensated for the weight of the water and it throws everything off. So always triple check to tear the scale before you add your plaster. Come on. There we go. A quick note about plaster and how I store it and why I store it this way. So plaster, just like the one ring wants to be found, plaster wants to bond with water. So I keep it in these 5-gallon buckets protected by these fancy lids that are completely air and water tight. And I only like to use these small containers. Now there are some artists that I know that like to use larger containers, but I live in the Pacific Northwest. The air is very humid, and if I put it into like a big garbage can, there is no way that I'd be able to use all of that plaster before the air eventually got to it, and it would reduce its strength and its setting abilities. When it comes to bubbles in the plaster, I'm only really worried about bubbles on the surface of the mold because those will show up when I do the slip casting. If there are bubbles inside of the plaster, it doesn't really concern me. But that being said, I like to have as few bubbles as possible in the entire affair. Now, there are people that put their plaster through a vacuum chamber to completely de-air it before pouring it. That is a little fancy for me. That being said, I do remember a long time ago, I went to this thing called Ensika. It's like this ceramics conference. And I went there specifically to look at the molds of a fellow by the name of Mitchell Spain. And let me tell you, that guy can make some molds. And I remember looking at him in person and thinking they look even better in person than they did online. So what I'm getting around to is he wrote a book, and I can't recommend it enough. I'm gonna put a link to it in the description for this video. I learned a lot about how to better mix plaster, and he made me a better mold maker than I was before. So check out that book. I can't recommend it enough. Okay, if you are doing plaster in your studio, you do not want any plaster to get into your plumbing. I have a 2-step protection that I do to keep all of the plaster out of my pipes. It starts with the plaster bucket. And that is the 5-gallon bucket of water that I keep next to the plaster. I use this to rinse out all my tools. I shave the molds into them, I sand the molds in these, and I rinse out all of the majority of the plaster from my mixing buckets into this. And then this water eventually gets sifted and dumped out where it's not gonna go into my pipes. And oh man, it's time to mix plaster. Okay, we are at plumbing ground zero. I have just rinsed out a bucket that had a little bit of plaster residue in it, and it went right down the drain. Am I panicking? No. Why? Because I've got a plaster trap.
This is the plaster trap. It is a bucket that lives underneath the sink, and it operates on the principle that plaster is heavier than water. So any plaster that comes down through the drain in the sink will sink to the bottom of this 5-gallon bucket. Water, being heavier than plaster, will rise to the top and then will continue down through the drain. This is like a gigantic P-trap, what every sink drain has, but in a huge size. Now this one is nice because I can swap this 5-gallon bucket out. I'll put a link to this system. This was designed for dental offices because they handle a lot of plaster. But there are also guidelines online for how to make your own out of just like Rubbermaid containers. There's lots of options. Just make sure that you have one of these on any sink that you're going to be rinsing plaster residue in. It's essential. Okay, that's enough tips. It's time to return to casting, just in time for part number 10. Now, I know I said we're done with tips, but I do want to talk about this vibrating table. Hang on one second.
Number 10.
Okay, yeah, so this table, it is not essential and it is expensive.
Here we go.
I would only recommend it if you are, like I am, a professional. If you do this all the time and you're looking for the most bubble-free, perfect molds you can manage, I do think it's a good tool, an essential tool, but like I said, it is pricey, so you don't need to have it. In fact, I cast molds just fine for almost a decade before I bought this thing, so don't consider it essential. You don't need to panic if you don't have one in your studio, and lots of folks make their own using like a power tool or running a sander at the side of a table.
Woo! We did it! 10 molds, 2 days. I'm kind of proud of myself. Let's get this one strapped up. Here it is, all cleaned up and ready for strapping. Mold number 10. Still can't believe I did it in 2 days. Am I exhausted? Yes. Am I relieved? Also yes. So I've run out of my long mold straps. I only have shorter mold straps, and that means I don't have enough to loop back and protect the mold when I tighten this cam. So I just use little squares of foam core, put them in there. Keeps the mold safe. Alrighty, we have spent the last few days putting a ton of water into these molds, and now it's time for us to get the water back out. Brace yourself for some more mold math, plaster edition, while I stick this into the kiln room to dry.
Okay, here we go. Now, to mix up an entire mold, all of the pieces, we used a total of 22.5 pounds of plaster and 7.5 quarts of water. Now, we didn't use all of that plaster and water. Remember, we ended up dumping out a little bit of the extra that we didn't use for the thing. So the best way to get a total amount of plaster and water used is to weigh a freshly finished mold. It just so happens that Mrs. VanTiki has a shipping scale that can handle the weight of a freshly cast mold, and here it is. Altogether, it weighs 36 pounds and 3 ounces. Now, keep in mind, this is a fresh mold. There is a lot of extra water in this mold. Most of the water has bonded with the gypsum to create a strong plaster body, and some more water will continue to bond with that gypsum, but there is an awful lot of water in this mold that has just got to evaporate away into the air before we can use it for casting. How much water? Well, the best way to find out is to weigh a second mold, and this mold has dried out completely over the course of 2 weeks. 24 pounds and 8 ounces. Your eyes do not deceive you. That is a difference of 11 pounds and 11 ounces. 11 pounds of water that we've got to throw into the air. Now, if you think of that in terms of gallons, that is 1.4 gallons of water per mold, and we've got 10 molds. That means over the course of the next few weeks, we have got to force over 14 gallons of water out of these molds and into the air.
So that's a lot of water, and it's all got to come out of these molds and into this studio air. It's going to take days, if not weeks. We're going to have the kilns running. That will help, and we'll have a fan on them, and that will also help to bring that moisture out of the molds. In the meantime, I will edit the next episode of Tiki Technical Tuesday. It is the silicone mold making episode. Hopefully you've already watched it, and I suggest after this, you watch an episode on how slip casting works, so you'll know just why we are using plaster for these molds. I will see you on the next episode of Tiki Technical Tuesday when we actually start casting these things. See you then.